Public speaking. I didn't realize I was that good of an actor, because I would rather listen than do public speaking. Of course, you know, since Patrick asked me to share in this, the closer the time came, and of course there was one delay that it was moved further away, and I was in tune with that because I thought, give me a little more time. But as time got closer and closer, then your mind just starts, or at least my mind just starts taking off, and it's been all over the place about public speaking anyhow, and I can tell you right now that I would love to hear a topic on public speaking from any of you, maybe next time. But yeah, I took, in fact, one day I was sitting in my van. I was waiting on something, I forget what it was. But I got on my phone, and this thing came up about public speaking out of I don't know where. And I thought, that's interesting. Evidently the Lord had something there for me. And so I read a little bit about it. And of course there are people all over the internet that have ideas on public speaking. I mean, I was amazed, even just yesterday, I was doing some research, and I couldn't believe all the different numbers of things, groups of things that people have for you to follow, their advice for public speaking. It says, this one guy said that 30% of all people fear public speaking. Is there anyone here today who loves public speaking, loves to do public speaking? Raise your hand. Of course, now sometimes we, in a group, we might speak up. You know, we love to be the one with the best joke, maybe, or the best story. But, well, so far I haven't seen any hands. And in growing up, I've been impressed, you know, by people that are enjoyable to listen to, and yeah, you just look forward to hearing certain people speak, and everyone as well, but there are some that truly do impress you. So I took these two words, first of all, public speaking. The word public, you know, we're doing it publicly, we're not privately. I am speaking to you, and then speaking is verbal communication, is one way. Now there's other signs and ways that you can do public speaking, but it's done done by someone with someone else to say something. And components of speaking. There are several things that are very important. Components of speaking, or what speaking is made of. Pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. And I think, I'm not sure, I may have told Patrick at his ordination, and I don't know where I heard it, but there are three things that go with public speaking. And it actually came up yesterday when I was reading about it, and I learned where the three things come from. I had no idea that this was the originator of these three things. But the first one is stand up, the second one is speak up, and the next one is shut up. And does anyone know where this came from? It was actually Martin Luther. I was kind of surprised, but he is the one who came up with that. Of course, you know, he was I guess he was a German man, so sometimes the Germans are kind of blunt and say what they think. Stand up, speak up, and shut up. That was very interesting. I actually took classes at CBS. Several classes I remember. That was one class was public speaking. The problem is I don't remember too much that I learned there, and I'm not sure where my material is that I took notes on or whatever. I didn't even look for it. And of course, you know, there were, another class was song leadership and ushering, and I remember that one as well. But Willie Wagler was the teacher, if I remember right, the class public speaking. I'm trying to, I don't think there are any current CBS students, or someone, Lamar's would be the most current student probably from CBS. He's not here, but I'm just really curious if they still have a class in public speaking. I would guess they do, but I don't know, at CBS. Anyhow, Willie Wagler, he said that when you're speaking, when you're a public speaker, you know, of course, he said make eye contact, I'm sure. That's another thought comes to my mind. I hope I don't lose it. But he said you need to be talking. Say the room is full of people. It isn't today, but you need to speak so you're talking to the person in the back corner. And maybe even if there's no one there, you should speak well enough that there would be someone in the back of the building who could hear and understand you. And you know, when I think of some of the speakers, it seems that the state of Kansas, Hutchinson, Kansas, Partridge, a lot of people there are fairly good speakers. And of course, they put a lot of emphasis, I guess, on education and so on, and maybe that's why they are pretty good speakers. One thing we need to do, and I'm going to tell you right off the bat that my notes are totally in my mind. You might find that out. But they're kind of the ramblings of my mind, and I think they're totally unorganized. I told my wife I'm going to go through this again, get everything organized. You know what I did? I just kept jotting things in here and there, and different colored pen and ink. So here we go. But, you know, first of all, we need to realize who we are speaking to. We are speaking to an audience. And then I remember one thing Willie said, that most speakers have habits when they're talking. And of course, I made a list of things, and I just did it. I don't know if you caught it or not, but things you're not supposed to do when you are public speaking. Don't scratch your head. Don't touch your face. But you know, what do? Like, even when I was leading singing this morning, my nose started itching. So what are you supposed to do? You're not supposed to put your hands on your hips or adjust your clothing. My biggest fear is when I get up front, even for song lead. Now, I'm pretty safe here, but I try to mentally make a note, and we're all men here, so I'm going to say this, but that I'm afraid my zipper's open. Especially when I'm down there in the front leading singing, and you know, you're not supposed to touch your clothing. Well, I don't know if it's ever happened, but I try to mentally make a note that that job has been taken care of, because I have forgotten. I was working somewhere. I was a forklift driver and had a radio hanging on the forklift. And someone sent a message across this radio, and there was another fellow there close by. I was off the forklift, maybe, I don't know, within 10 feet or something. And I asked the guy, I said, "Did you understand what that guy said over the radio?" He said, "No. Tell him to get the mush out of his mouth." except he didn't use the word mush. But that's one thing that we need to do, is to speak clearly. And sometimes when we get up front, our mouths dry up, our tongue swells up, it feels like, and dries up, and then we have a hard time speaking clearly, so bear with me. But in my growing up days, there were certain men who impressed me as speakers. And probably the first one that I thought of was Hadley. Well, his name was Joe Miller. And if I'm not mistaken, he was kind of the founder of Blue Ridge International, the Haiti organization. He was very involved in that. They called him, he was from Hadley, Pennsylvania. How many would remember him? They called him Hadley Joe. But he came to Berea. There were several, thank you. He came to Berea one Sunday, and actually, I think he's a cousin to Sam Gingrich somehow. Maybe his wife, I don't know. But anyhow, he had a voice. And then, he had a loud voice, and of course, he was a preacher. I think he enjoyed it too. But at one point, he said, "Is this microphone on?" And then he said, "Well, it doesn't matter." He said, "I got a built-in microphone." And he did. I mean, he was, of course, Berea is kind of a small auditorium, but he really was enthused about speaking, and you could hear it. There was a cousin of mine, I don't know how many of you would remember him, Louis Overholt. He would have been in Friedensheim, Germany for many years. I think he's still living, I'm not sure. He would have been a first cousin to my grandpa. But I heard him preach several times, and I was just amazed. I mean, and I mentioned it to Johnny Miller's brother, Jimmy. Jimmy came up from Virginia Beach to Minerva, and we were in the 10th grade together. Johnny was our teacher, Johnny Miller. And I mentioned something to Jimmy that I really enjoyed listening to Louis Overholt preach. And he said, "Yeah, it's just like there's a fire burning inside of him." And that's about the way it was. Yeah, he was very interesting. And then, of course, there are, I guess we call them TV preachers, or evangelists that have large crusades. And there's one, I'm not going to mention this guy's name, but there was one TV preacher that I used to love to listen to, because he would sing and he would preach, but then he got involved in extramarital affairs, and it just kind of soured me. So I think he has passed away since, but I had quit listening to him even before that happened. But one person I still enjoy listening to at times is Billy Graham. And I don't know if you've ever listened much to his sermons, but in the way he presents them, the way he talks, well, they say that Aidan Troyer was another person that I loved to listen to speak, and they said that he's the Billy Graham of the Mennonites. I don't know if you ever heard that or not, but he would even talk and pronounce if you listen to them, they somehow say the words with the letter R in differently. But yeah, they were inspiring to me. And of course, then there's you all probably remember Harley Yoder. Not too many of you would probably remember Harry Yoder. His son, Tim, is the bishop at Chestertown, Maryland. I'm not sure what the name of the church is there. But they would come to Minerva. John Dan Miller, Uri Shetler. Those men especially, I remember that John Dan and Harry Yoder, they were maybe a little shorter of stature, but they would come to Minerva for evangelistic meetings. And of course, they would walk the pulpit, and they were not screaming, but they were preaching. and until they would get red in the face, and their veins would even kind of stick out, and then they'd squat down yet. And it was, for a young person growing up, it was, they had your attention. And I was blessed by them. In fact, this Harry Yoder, I think he said one time that, I don't know if our pulpit in Minerva was this high or not, but he said, I could jump as high as this pulpit. He was trying to, I don't know what he was trying to bring out, but I remember that, him saying that. Then I grew up with another man, Henry Raber. And he worked for me. We worked together at Ideal for a while. And then he worked for me as well for a while. And he was a little, I'm saying this nicely or not to put him down, but he was a little slower as far as work concerned. But I was amazed. He was ordained. But I was amazed how that when he would preach, he was a different man. He could preach. And I was blessed by that. Just to tell you that I think when Henry was a boy, you probably never looked at him that close, but he had one blue eye and one brown eye. And I asked him one time, what's the deal? He said, well, when he was a boy, they had a muck farm and lived on the muck, and somehow he got in the way, and of course, the muck ground is soft, but he said these little Caterpillar tractors drove over his head. The tracks actually drove over his head. After that, his eye color changed. But I don't know if that had anything to do with his performance or not in the work field. But as far as preaching, he enjoyed preaching. And then, of course, I don't know, and I should have come down here and practiced. But another preacher that got my attention when he was here is Josh's dad, when he slapped the pulpit that time. I don't know if too many people were, and I don't remember what he was saying when he slapped the pulpit, but he got my attention too. How many of you remember that? There's a few, but that's the problem, when preachers and teachers are talking sometime, we're listening, half listening, and then our minds are somewhere else as well, and we're trying to do two things at once. But I'll admit, that's where I was when he slapped the pulpit, and I'm like, wake up, pay attention. There was, when I was a youth and going to the youth fellowship meetings, there was a youth who was, I don't think he was married, and he was from Kansas at the time. Don't think he's living there at this time, but he was assigned to give a topic. Fortunately, I was never asked to give a topic at the youth fellowship meetings, and that's when they were all together. Well, I should say not all. We had an eastern and a western district, and there were, I don't know, maybe up to 500 young people at one of these meetings. But anyhow, he was asked to give a topic, and he gave this topic, and I guess he may have been an orator, I don't know, but he had written it out or typed it out. Then he memorized the whole thing, memorized his whole topic. How long they were, I don't know. I'm guessing maybe a half hour. And that was impressive to think that someone could actually memorize it and repeat their topic. And not sure if he ever looked at his notes or words or not. Of course, then I had to think too of the many presidents, some of them who can speak very well and out of both sides of their mouth, matter of fact. But I had to think of one president especially who was maybe not known as a good public speaker. And in a sense, he competed with an orator, and that was President Lincoln. And I'm not sure of the orator's name other than Douglas, I think was his name. But Douglas had a long speech, Lincoln had a short one. And whose speech do we remember today? I mean, you could probably look up the speech that Douglas gave, but we know Lincoln's as the Gettysburg Address. course, I grew up as a preacher's kid. Dad was ordained the year I was born. And he would sometimes preach at home before he would preach at church. And then sometimes he'd just be walking around the living room and preaching. So we got to listen to him there as well. Someone once, he said, told us one time, I think it was, I'm not really sure where it was, but someone mentioned to him after he had preached one time that he has a gute stem. Does someone know what that is? Good voice? Okay. I tried looking it up on my phone, and the phone couldn't answer it. Of course, maybe I didn't spell it right either. But of course, he would always kind of start in slow, and then he'd get wound up sometimes. And then, of course, he always said we'd kind of get on him about going overtime, and then he'd say, hey, at the end is when you really get going. It's hard to stop. But I remember one of the last times he preached at Amanda, where my brother used to live. And afterwards, my brother was kind of bragging on him and said that he showed them guys how to preach. Walking around, and of course, he used a lot of hand motions sometimes, and he had pretty good volume. Back in those days, they didn't wear these things on their ears. And barely, I don't know if we even had microphones sometimes. But he was a good example to me of public speaking. And I remember as a small boy, we would go back to the Hartville Conservative Church, and whenever they would ask Dad to preach, it would give me a warm, fuzzy feeling to think that, they still accepted him as a preacher, that they asked him to preach. Sometimes, when a speaker gets up, things that he does, one thing he does is he'll lay out his watch up here so he can make it look like he's going to go by the clock or keep time. Of course, sometimes you wonder, I wonder if he can read that. Going back to Henry Raber, he said he remembers sitting in the Beachy Church at Hartville, and this was before he was a Christian. And I'm not sure if the clock was on the side. And he would sit there and he'd look real intent on the preacher preaching away. And then he'd whip his head around and look at the clock. Try to get the preacher's attention, what time it was. That was kind of humorous to me. Back in Minerva, we had a preacher there for a while. He actually came from he was ordained in the older Amish church, came there, and of course, when someone came to our church who was ordained a preacher, they would be allowed to preach some, and then the church would vote whether they wanted to accept them to continue their preaching or not. But in the old order church, and of course, I'm going to inject here to public speaking. Each person's public speaking is, in my mind, it's largely affected by our personalities, our upbringing. There's a lot of things that affect our public ability to do public speaking. But anyhow, he was not the best public speaker. In fact, John Miller was there visiting. Janice would have been teaching school there, and John Miller came out, or at least he was there. And he was sitting beside me in church. That's the John Miller at Sandy Ridge. He was sitting beside me in church, and this preacher would be preaching away, and he wouldn't look at the people. He'd just look at the ceiling. Finally, John whispered to me, "Nice ceiling you have here." And of course, it was dangerous. I'm going to tell you this right now. And John says, I have dreamt up more things that happened that never did happen. But I don't think I dreamt. I can still see that. But that was one thing that, as far as, you're supposed to look at your audience, make eye contact with different people for a certain amount of seconds. You don't have to try to out-stare anyone unless they're misbehaving. But speaking of Dad preaching, I think I was probably at least 14. We came out to Indiana to either employ Janice as a teacher. We came out in the summer in between just to visit. I'm not sure, but we were at Irvin Miller's, Lynn's parents' place. And in the morning, we were at Maple Lawn Church. In the evening, Dad wanted to go to the Woodlawn Church to visit there. So he was asked to preach there. I don't remember if he preached at Maple Lawn, but I know he did. No, he did at Woodlawn. And of course, an Irvin Miller family decided they're going to go too because we were going. So they went. Well, unfortunately, John Miller and I were sitting beside each other during that service with Harold Yoder, if you know him. We had visited in River Forest. I had picked up these little syringes out of the wastebasket they gave people shots with. I think the needle was broken or taken off, but I put this, I like to collect things, but put this in my pocket and I took it to church that evening. Dad was preaching and I got this syringe out of my pocket and John said, "Give me that thing," or whispered to me. So I gave it to him, and there were flies in church. Well, this fly came over and sat on one of our legs, and he took this thing and blew it away with that syringe, and I burst out laughing. I think it was maybe 14 or maybe 15 years old. Dad was preaching, and he stopped, and he said, "Philip, you want to come sit up here on the front bench?" And then he continued preaching. Now, how do you do that? You're preaching and you're distracted and your son is misbehaving, and then you tell him to come, then you keep right on going. I don't know how it worked, but don't know what he was preaching either. But yeah, those things take place. And thinking of that, I had to think, people used to call out their boys, or back home in church, there was one man who used to walk up the aisle and go over and reach into his son if he was misbehaving, get him by the ear and take him out and take him back to his seat. Of course, that could be a distraction to a public speaker as well. There was one, and I'm not going to mention his name, I don't think he's living anymore. There was one speaker, preacher in Ohio. Whenever he would have a message, he would ask his family, "How did I do?" And that was, I guess, where he got his feedback or pat on the back. I'm not sure which. There was, I'm kind of like, we have, we sometimes idolize or think a lot of good speakers. But we have to be ourselves. We cannot be someone else. Now we can, some people are good at imitating other people and maybe even how they speak, but we need to be ourselves. We can learn from others. I consider myself a listener rather than a public speaker. Even sometimes, I'm in a group and people are talking about things and there's misinformation. I'm more apt just to stay quiet unless they call on me and say, what do you think? But there's one writer said that you learn by listening. If you're always speaking, you're not really learning anything. Although I have learned that by speaking, even to yourself, when you're by yourself, but even in public speaking, and this might happen here, I might learn a few things by giving this presentation, but sometimes just by verbalizing, we can learn things. I remember in school, public speaking in school, elementary school. One day they had what they called a literary event. I don't know if it was contest and that's where you you memorize a short story or poem, whatever. Wasn't singing, it was speaking. And you would get up front, and of course I learned a poem, and I still know part of it today, but then, by the time my turn came around, I was just jittery, all shook up, and I could give it, but I could hardly, it wasn't comfortable. But then I had a cousin there, a second cousin, who, his dad was a fairly good speaker, but he got up there and he acted, he recited his literary event like there was nothing to it. And I'm like, boy, that would really be something, if a guy could do that. Matter of fact, when I went to VS, I got his dad to fill out my questionnaire. And while I was there, we had dorm life there when I was in VS. And of course, the guys would sit around talking, and then they started saying that, oh yeah, when they're on night shift, they would go into the office. I don't know why the office wasn't locked. They would go into the office, open the file cabinet, and read the results of the questionnaire that they handed out to come to this place for service. So one night I was on night duty, and I went in there and found my questionnaire that this man had filled out for me, and he had, the only thing I remember, and I'm pretty sure I didn't read anyone else's. If I did, I don't remember what or who or what it said, but I remember one thing it said on mine is that and this is when I'm still in my teens, or no, I'd have been 20 at the time. He said that I'm very comfortable in public speaking or being up front giving a topic. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like Patrick said, I didn't know I'm not much into drama, so I didn't know I was that good of an actor. And of course, when you were in the youth group and went to these fellowship meetings that I was talking about earlier, when you were the president of your youth group, the introduction time came around, in front of these 300 to 500 people, young people, older people, and you would have your youth group stand and introduce them. You'd be up front. And, before my turn, or years before, I think, boy, that'd be kind of fun, Well, one year I had to do it, and by the time I got up there, I didn't know if I could talk or not. But and there's ways, if you look up courses on public speaking, there's probably ways they tell you how to deal with your nervousness and your butterflies, they call it. I remember someone asks, and a public speaker, do you ever get up front and don't have butterflies or jittery? And he says, probably not. He said, it's always there, but it's something that you need to channel that energy into your public speaking. Then I had to wonder, have people influenced my way of public speaking? Maybe, maybe not. Have they influenced your way of public speaking? Now, probably if I would have had a strong, or felt a strong calling to be a preacher or a teacher, or maybe if public speaking would come easy for me, it's something that I would have sought after, because, there are certain things we like to do, so we kind of try to educate or learn about those things. And then I had to think, I don't know what kind of speaker I am. Do you know what kind of speaker you are? Everyone is unique. And like I mentioned, our personality, I think, and our environment has a lot to do with it. And in reading about public speaking, you even mentioned that experience is good for you. Well, how do you get experience in public speaking? If you don't like public speaking, do you tell someone, I'd like to have a topic, I'd like to have devotions, I'd like to preach? I remember one guy was counseling me one time and admonishing me, and then finally I says, well, what am I supposed to do, run for being preacher? And I don't remember what his answer was, but I remember as a youth, older youth, one time I was sitting in I don't recall that it's happened lately, but sometimes we have speakers that they're looking at the clock and they see that their time is not up, so they kind of start over. Have you ever heard anything like that? They kind of start over. I'm not talking about reviewing. When you review something, they go back and say, I'd like to emphasize these points. But they kind of start over giving the points in their message, and then I had to think, if we think we have to do that, it's kind of like an airplane. You come into an airport to land, and it's not your turn to land, so you kind of circle around, look for a place to land. And I had to think that, fortunately, I don't think there are too many like that, but that one time that story or that incident came to my mind. I asked my wife about this one. I had a school, first year Minerva had Christian day school. Our teacher was a teacher. He was a real teacher. He loved to talk. He loved to teach. I figured sometime he would become a preacher, which he never did, but he would after he was long time retired, he'd be in Florida for the winter, and they would ask him to have Bible teachings on eschatology at the tourist church. But as a school teacher, he would get so carried away talking, which reminds me, I need to take a drink. And that reminds me of another story. But he would get so carried away with teaching and speaking that he'd get this little white thing on his lips. Not in maybe in the center somewhere. But I hope it don't gross you out. But this thing would start connecting, and when he'd be talking, this white string would be going back and forth. So I asked my wife, should I tell that story? And she says, definitely. So you need to lick your lips or take a drink or take a break. And there is such a thing that these public speaking topics talk about, and it's called the 3-second rule, because it gets people's attention. You stop for 3 seconds. You don't have to have a timer, but anyhow, it gets people's attention, and then they want to know what's going on. But anyhow, that was quite interesting, but he was a teacher. See where I am here now. Oh, I could have done this at the beginning, but I'm sure you all have heard that, about the preachers that get up front and say, that I'd rather not be up here, I'd rather be sitting in the back. There's so many others that can do it so much better than I can. Well, there was a man, preacher, who I think he asked someone, and this happened at Woodlawn, he asked someone if they would have devotions or a topic or something. He said, I'd rather not. He says, there's others that can do it a lot better than I can. And he said, I know they can. They can do it better, but I'm asking you. I never forgot that story. I thought it was pretty good. Well, I know they can. I know others can do it better, but I'm asking you. So you need to have experience. It's good to get experience. I'm going to go through some numbers now. Things that I found. There's the number one rule of public speaking is, they say, to make the audience the center of your universe. And that, of course, is who you're speaking to if you're public speaking. Make the audience. It's you and the audience. And then there are seven P's of public speaking: pronunciation, pace, pause, punch, power, passion, and posture. Pronunciation, pace, pause, punch, power, passion, and posture. And I'm not going to dwell on any of those, but that reminds me I was reminded too of another, or I asked someone one time about a certain person. I said, what do you think of that guy? And he said, well, he knows how to talk. You know, some of us do, some of us don't. I remember too hearing of how someone mentioned that so-and-so told another person that they should take classes on public speaking. I don't know if anyone has ever told you that. No one has told me that yet. But they should, this person told another person, which that would be kind of interesting. And then there's some more numbers. There's 4 P's of public speaking. This back here was 7 P's. Another one had 4 P's of public speaking is preparation, practice, presentation, and performance. And then the one gave 5 most important skills in public speaking. The interesting thing is the list had 7, and then it had the thing down at the bottom and said more. But those are clear articulation, confidence, ability to connect, presentation, style, passion, practice speaking, focus on your body language. Which reminds me of practice. I think there was years ago, it may have been a preacher, some well-renowned preacher or evangelist, you may remember who it is, that would be out preaching to a stump. Does anyone know who that was? Was that D.L. Moody? I'm not sure who it was, but I've heard that. Another thing I just thought of, my wife accuses me of when I'm public speaking, I never finish one sentence and I jump into another one. Well, I enjoy that, which she doesn't. But maybe that's in some of these lessons for public speaking. Then there's 3 S's of public speaking: structure, story, and self. This person said, without these 3 will be facts without flow and substance. Structure, story, and self. Without these 3, there will be facts without flow or substance. Visual effect without impact, and audience without interest. It says most things in life have a beginning, middle, and end, except a bad presentation. Now, some of these things I don't even understand myself fully, but I thought that was interesting about the bad presentation. I'm not sure. It says somewhere I read too that after an event, a poor speech is always at the top of things talked about. Is always at the top of things people complain about. After an event, a poor speech is talked about. Well, a good speech is also talked about. If someone has a good message or a good presentation as a teacher. Then there are 6 C's of effective language usage in public speaking: clarity, color, concreteness, correctness. There's concreteness, correctness, conciseness, and cultural sensitivity. A lot of these are intertwined with each other. Then there's, like I said, there's all different kinds of things, and if you want to learn, or you can buy courses to take, if you really want to be good at public speaking. There's a 90-10 rule of public speaking. 10% of your brain is to retain or to work on your presentation content, and the 90% about delivery and contact with the audience. So delivering it is, they're saying 90%. Delivery and contact with audience. 10% to remember what you want to say. Then there was a 13 and 10 steps of public speaking, 3-second rule in public speaking, which I mentioned. Then the question was asked, why do I get nervous when presenting? Well, they said, now this, I had to wonder after I copied these things down, if this is from a Christian perspective or a natural, worldly perspective. And of course, we need to recognize there are Christian speakers and there are worldly speakers. But public speaking anxiety, it says, is in our DNA. Public speaking, we take public speaking as an attack. Physiologically, registers register an audience as a threatening predator and mount a comparable response. So they're saying that it's in our system, in our bodies, our makeup, to be nervous. We take it, in a sense, a little bit personal, and it varies in degrees to different people depending on your personality or makeup. Like I mentioned, there's sometimes we feel that our jaws tighten up, our mouths tighten up, our lips kind of contract rather than be open and flowing when we speak, when we get up front. And then there are other people, they get up when they're public speaking, that's their element. They enjoy it. It says our brains have transferred that ancient fear of being watched in public speaking. Even in work, I could always perform in work better if the customer wasn't standing back there watching. And of course, sometimes we're being watched and don't know it. One thing I had to think of to be effective in public speaking in your presentation is maybe the most important thing even, and that is of our testimony. Just recently, last weekend, when we were in Ohio, matter of fact, an older person there came to pass that, and he was a school teacher for years, and fairly good speaker because, school teachers get a lot of practice. But he was a good speaker, very good singer, and come to find out he had been meddling with things detrimental to his Christian life. So he quit. He was the adult Sunday school teacher, so he quit doing that. And our testimony is very important in public speaking. So I'm going to close with the 3 things that Martin Luther said about public speaking as far as performing public speaking, and that is to stand up, speak up, and shut up. I'm going to turn the time back to Patrick.